The chamber smelled like 17 different worlds. That was the first thing Suvel always noted when the Galactic Conclave opened its grand sessions, the smell. 17 atmospheric mixes pumped through 17 separate vents, blended just enough so that no species choked, not enough so that any species felt at home. It was a compromise in the air itself, a metaphor that nobody had ever bothered to name because the conclave ran on metaphors it refused to examine. Suvel sat in the Athene observer box, a curved bench of pale stone, third tier, left side, and watched the chamber fill. It was a beautiful chamber. He would always admit that, even later, when beauty felt like the wrong word for anything connected to this place. The ceiling was a dome of clear alloy, and through it you could see the stars. New Geneva Station hung in orbit above a gas giant whose rings caught the light of two suns, and the effect, the gold and the violet, and the slow wheel of the rings, made the chamber look like something holy. It was not holy, but it looked. The human delegation arrived at exactly the scheduled time. That was not unusual. Humans were punctual. What was unusual was how they sat, not the posture, not the dress, which was formal and correct, but the stillness. There were 12 of them at the long, curved table assigned to Earth, and they sat the way stone sits, not rigid, not tense, just completely, absolutely still. Ambassador Chen Jing was at the center. She was a small woman with short gray hair and a dark blue coat that had the small silver pin of Earth's diplomatic corps on the left lapel. Suvel had met her twice before in hallway conversations. She had a dry sense of humor and a habit of asking questions that sounded simple, until you sat with them for a few hours and realized they had no good answer. She was not asking questions today. She was watching. The session opened with the standard ceremonial words, a speech by the conclave master that praised unity, cooperation, and the great shared work of civilized peoples. The conclave master was of Vreth, tall and pale-skinned, with the characteristic double-jointed neck that let his head tilt at angles that looked wrong to human eyes. His name was Arch-Chancellor Drevon, and he had been in his position for 11 years, and he was very good at the ceremonial words. He was very good, in general, at words. The legislation was called the Galactic Resource Optimization and Labor Allocation Act, Amendment 7. It was 43 pages long. It had been written over a period of 2 years by a committee of 12 species, drafted and redrafted, and the final language had been approved by legal scholars from 9 different civilizations before it ever reached the floor. Not one human had been consulted. Not one. The summary, as read by the session clerk, a Solari with a voice like a deep bell, was as follows. Humanity was to be reclassified as a class. 3 labor species under conclave law. Their star systems would remain their own in name. Their cultural practices would be respected within the limits of productive scheduling. Their workers, the word used was times contributors. Times would be assigned to conclave member species on a rotating basis, managed by a central allocation office, compensated at a rate determined by the conclave economic board. The word slavery was not used. The word times, opportunity times, was used 4 times. Suvel wrote in his journal, in small, careful letters. The distance between a word and a thing is the size of a civilization's conscience. He underlined it. Then he looked back at the chamber floor. The Solari ambassador was speaking now, a smooth, practiced voice explaining that this was not a punitive measure, not in any way, but rather a recognition of humanity's remarkable adaptive capabilities and the conclave's responsibility to ensure those capabilities served the greater galactic good. The humans had joined the conclave only 60 years ago. They were, by every metric, the youngest and smallest of the member species. They lacked the technological depth of the Vreth. They lacked the population spread of the Solari. What they had, and the ambassador said this, with what looked like genuine warmth, was a work ethic and a resilience that was, frankly, inspirational. They were being enslaved because they were good at surviving hard things. Suvel wrote that down too. The vote call came after 2 hours of speeches, 2 hours of kind, measured, civilized language, explaining why this was necessary, logical, and ultimately beneficial for all concerned. 2 hours during which Chen Jing sat without moving, her hands flat on the table in front of her, her face arranged in an expression that gave away exactly nothing. The Vreth voted yes. The Solari voted yes. The Keth, the Moon, the Doralai, the Preth Collective, the San, the Hilori, the Giovanni, yes, 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 yes. 11 species. 11 votes. All yes. The conclave master turned to the human delegation and offered them, as was the tradition for the affected party in a classification vote, 30 seconds to respond before the result was formally entered into the galactic record. Chen Jing stood. The chamber went quiet. Not politely quiet. Quiet in the way a room goes quiet when something shifts in the air, and every creature present feels it before they can name it. She stood and she looked at the chamber. She turned her head slowly, taking in every delegation, every face, every species that had shared trade agreements with Earth, signed mutual defense pacts with Earth, sent cultural exchange delegations to Earth, attended Earth's admission ceremony to the conclave 60 years ago, with speeches about the great family of intelligent peoples. She looked at all of them. She looked for a long time. 29 seconds passed. Then she said, "Noted." The conclave security forces came through the main doors before the echo of the word had finished moving through the chamber. They were Keth, large, armored, efficient, and they had clearly been positioned and briefed well in advance. They moved to the human delegations table with the practiced calm of people doing an administrative task, rather than an arrest. The humans did not resist. They stood when asked to stand. They walked when directed to walk. They did not shout. They did not struggle. One of the younger members of the delegation, a man of perhaps 30, with a cut on his chin from what looked like a recent shaving accident, turned his head as he was being guided out, and looked back at the chamber. Once. Just once. Then they were gone. The conclave master called a brief recess. Suvel sat in the observer box and did not move. Around him, other observers from non-voting species were doing the same. The Bellari, the Chonai, the others who had attended but held no vote, no stake, no voice. Some of them were talking quietly among themselves. The Bellari observer on his left said something about how this would stabilize the outer rim labor markets. Suvel wrote nothing. He looked at his journal for a while. Then he looked up through the dome at the gas giant's rings. Still turning, still catching the gold and the violet light. He did not know yet that he was watching the last ordinary afternoon in galactic history. On Kepler, 442b. In a monitoring post the size of a large closet that smelled permanently of recycled air and burnt coffee substitute, Commander Ilara Vasquez watched the vote feed on a screen slightly smaller than her hand. The post was technically a seismic survey station. It was registered under a geology research permit issued by the Doralai Trade Bureau. It had been built 6 years ago and had never, in those 6 years, performed any seismic surveys. Ilara watched Chen Jing say, "Noted." She watched the Keth security officers come through the doors. She sat for a moment. The monitoring post had 3 chairs, 2 of which were currently occupied by Sergeant Davio Conquo and technical specialist Rin Tagawa, who were also watching the feed. Nobody spoke. The feed cut out 12 minutes after the security officers entered, presumably because someone on the conclave's communications staff realized that the session was still being broadcast on open channels. 12 minutes. That was long enough to see everything important. Ilara reached across the workstation to the secondary terminal, an older machine, jury-rigged to the main system with cables that had been soldered by hand, and opened a new file. The file was not connected to the conclave network. It was not connected to any network. It lived only on the physical drive of this machine, encrypted with a key that existed only in her memory. She titled the file, "Atmospheric Pressure Points Vreth Colony Class Vessels." She started typing. Okonkwo watched her for a moment. He was a big man who had a habit of being very quiet when things were serious and very loud when things were not. And right now, he was extremely quiet. He looked at the blank feed screen. He looked at Ilara's hands on the keyboard. "How long?" he asked. 3 years, Ilara said. "Maybe 2 if they push the implementation schedule. And after that?" She kept typing. "Open the other file. The infrastructure one. Start with water processing. The Vreth outer colonies use a shared network. I want to know every node." "To do." Okonkwo opened the file. Tagawa, who was younger than both of them, and had been with them for only 8 months, and who had never fully believed that this day would actually come, said nothing for a while. Then she said, quietly, "They just, all of them? Every single one?" "Yes," Ilara said. The Helori too? We have a cultural agreement with the Helori. There's a Helori art exchange program at the university. Yes, Elara said. Tagawa stopped talking. She turned back to her screen. After a moment, she began pulling up files she had prepared months ago and never wanted to use. The coffee substitute finished brewing. Nobody got up to pour it. In the Conclave's Administrative Processing Center on New Geneva Station, the paperwork for Earth's reclassification moved with impressive speed. The Conclave, whatever else could be said about it, was bureaucratically efficient. Classification forms, allocation schedules, labor assignment protocols, all of it had been pre-prepared, because the vote's outcome had never genuinely been in doubt. The first labor assignments were distributed within 72 hours. 40,000 humans from Earth's outer settlements were the first batch people who had been living on the margins of Conclave-adjacent space anyway, economically dependent on trade that the new legislation would now simply formalize into something more structured. The allocation letters were sent in careful, clean language. There were instructions for what to bring. There were schedules. There was even a section titled, "What to Expect at Your Assignment Site," that used phrases like times diverse working environment times, and times opportunity for cross-species collaboration. Most of the humans who received these letters had no legal mechanism to refuse them. Earth's government no longer had a seat at the conclave table. Earth's diplomatic corps was, as of the vote, a non-entity. There was no appeal process, because the legislation had quietly removed the category of conclave member, in good standing, from Earth's designation and replaced it with managed labor species. And managed labor species did not have access to the conclave's legal arbitration system. It was all very clean. It was the kind of clean that takes enormous effort to produce. Chen Jing was held in a conclave administrative facility on the station for 11 days, before being transferred to an assignment site, not a labor camp. The transfer documents specified, but a specialized advisory post where her diplomatic experience could be appropriately utilized. The advisory post was on a Vreth science station at the edge of mapped space, 14 FTL jumps from Earth, and her role there was to help human workers integrate effectively with their Vreth supervisors. She was given a small room. She was given access to a limited communications terminal. She was given a schedule. She integrated effectively. Suvel returned to the Ethany home system 3 weeks after the vote. He submitted his observer's report to the Ethany Council, a factual document, clinical and precise, 12 pages describing the legislative session, the vote tally, the human delegation's response, and the initial implementation steps. At the end of the report, in the section marked Observer's Assessment, he wrote one paragraph. It read, "The human delegation's behavior throughout the session was notable for its discipline and restraint. Ambassador Chen Jing's single-word response, noted, merits particular attention. In my experience of 47 conclave sessions, I have never observed a party in a classification proceeding respond with so little. I do not know what to make of this. I am not certain the conclave knows what to make of it either. I would suggest that not knowing what to make of a thing is occasionally more dangerous than understanding it clearly." The council reviewed the report. They thanked Suvel for his thorough work. They filed it. They did not act on it. In the galactic record, the Ethany abstention was noted without comment. They had not voted yes. They had also not voted no. There was no mechanism in conclave law for abstention to carry moral weight, and the Ethany, as a species, had long believed that survival required a careful management of which battles to enter. Suvel understood this. He had believed it himself. For most of his life, he sat in his office on the Ethany homeworld, on an afternoon when the sky was the color of shallow water, and thought about Chen Jing's face in the moment before she said, "Noted." The stillness of it, the way her eyes had moved across the chamber, not angry, not despairing, but cataloging. The word for what he had seen on her face, he thought, was not grief, and it was not fury. It was measurement. He opened his journal to a new page. He wrote, "What are they counting?" He did not have an answer. He closed the journal and went to make tea, and the sky outside his window stayed the color of shallow water. And somewhere 14 FTL jumps from Earth, Ambassador Chen Jing sat in her small room at a Vreth science station and did not use her communications terminal for personal messages. She was using it for something else. Something she had started the moment the Keth officers stepped back and gave her access to the station's basic systems as part of her advisory role. Something very small, very careful, very patient. On Kepler 442b, Elara Vasquez typed without stopping until the coffee substitute was cold, and the file was 47 pages long, and Okonkwo had fallen asleep in his chair. Tagawa was still awake. She had been running calculations for the last 3 hours on a question that had seemed theoretical until today. Given the infrastructure layout of Vreth outer colony shipping lanes, what was the minimum number of access points needed to affect the maximum number of systems simultaneously? She had an answer. She had written it down. She had looked at it for a long time. Then she had opened a new document and started building the thing the answer required. Outside the monitoring post, Kepler 442b's orange-red sky moved through its long, slow evening, and the stars came out one by one. And among them, if you knew where to look, and Elara always knew where to look, were the faint drive signatures of Vreth patrol ships running their standard routes. Standard routes. Consistent timing. Logged in a conclave navigation database that was publicly accessible to all member species, and 1 or 2 categories of managed labor species who needed it for work purposes. Elara pulled up the database. She was, after all, a managed labor species now. She had access. She started reading. The Conclave's first quarterly report on human labor productivity was, by any measure, exceptional. Exceptional was the word used in the executive summary. It appeared 3 times in the first paragraph alone. The report had been compiled by the Conclave Economic Board, a body of 42 economists from 9 species, and it was a thorough and careful document that measured everything that could be measured and drew conclusions from every number it contained. It did not notice what the numbers were actually saying. Humans outperformed every labor projection by 340% in the first quarter. They learned new tasks faster than any previous class. 3 labor species. They adapted to different atmospheric environments with minimal medical intervention. They communicated effectively across species barriers. They caused almost no disciplinary incidents. They were, the report concluded, an ideal labor acquisition. Arch-Chancellor Dravan read the report on a Tuesday morning in his office on New Geneva Station. He had a cup of Vreth tea black, slightly bitter, the kind that required a stomach lining optimized for it, and he read the whole thing, including the appendices. He was a thorough man. That thoroughness was one of the qualities that had made him Arch-Chancellor. When he finished, he set the report down and felt a deep, satisfied sense of having made the right decision. He had the report distributed to all 11 voting species governments. He attached a personal note commending the Economic Board's work. In the margins of his own copy, in small, neat writing, he noted one figure that had mildly surprised him. The dropout rate for human workers in dangerous assignment categories was significantly lower than expected. Humans, apparently, were not only willing to take hazardous roles, they were requesting them. He found this admirable. A species with that kind of drive deserved, he felt, a good opportunity. He made a note to perhaps review compensation structures at the 18-month mark, if productivity remained high. He did not make a note to ask why humans wanted the dangerous jobs. In Camp 7, on the Vreth outer colony of Hessa Prime, a woman named Dr. Yusra Alamin was learning atmospheric chemistry. She was not learning it from books. She was learning it from the camp's maintenance systems, which she had been assigned to assist with because the Vreth supervisor had noted during her intake assessment that she had a background in biology and had decided that was close enough to technical work to be useful. The camp's atmospheric processor was old. It required attention. Yusra was good with her hands. She was also good with her mind. The Vreth atmospheric compound used in the outer colony habitats was called Hessian-4. It was necessary for Vreth workers to function at optimal capacity at these altitudes and pressures. For humans, it was according to the conclave safety documentation that nobody had actually read carefully within acceptable tolerance parameters at a concentration of up to 1.2 parts per million. The documentation was 30 years old. It had been written for short-term exposure. Nobody had run the numbers on long-term daily exposure in a sealed habitat. Yusra ran them. She ran them on a tablet that was officially logged as a maintenance diagnostic device. She ran them in the early hours of the morning when her bunk room was asleep around her. 12 humans in 12 cots, breathing the Hessian, 4 air that kept the Vreth workers in the adjacent section comfortable. When she had the numbers, she sat with them for a while. Then she wrote them in a code that looked like maintenance log notation, the kind of compressed technical shorthand that anyone glancing at the tablet would read as work records, and she filed the document under a name that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been told what to look for. 3 weeks later, a human worker in the adjacent facility on the same compound died of what the Vreth medical officer logged as cardiac failure. His name was Soren. He was 41 years old. He had requested a hazardous assignment because the hazardous assignment paid a slightly better ration allocation, and he had 2 children in an Earth settlement who were now in a different camp, and he had thought the extra rations might help somehow. Yusra noted Soren's death in her maintenance logs. In the code, under the file, she noted 6 other deaths over the following 2 months, from 4 different camps, all logged as cardiac events or respiratory incidents, all in habitats running Hessian. 4, at concentrations the conclave documentation called acceptable. She filed them all. The files went where all the files went. They went through the network that sounded like white noise. It had been built over the first 6 months of the labor program, and it was built out of nothing expensive, nothing that required hardware that wasn't already present in every camp and facility and assignment station where humans worked. It was built out of the patterns in ordinary communication. The rhythm of maintenance log submissions, the timing of shift change signals, the specific sequence of status updates that every human worker was required to send at the end of each work period, confirming they were present and functional. The Solari acoustic sensors monitored all human communications. This was logged openly in the camp. Administrative documents, there was no attempt to hide it. Communication monitoring was standard procedure for class. 3 labor species under conclave protocol. Every message was scanned for content flagged by the security filters. Organized resistance language, weapons references, coordination signals. The network didn't use any of those things. It used timing, 3-second delays in a status update that should have taken 1 second. A maintenance log submitted 4 minutes before the scheduled window, instead of on time. A work completion report that used the standard template but in a slightly different field order than the day before. To the Solari sensors, it was white noise, human workers being slightly imprecise, as biological beings tended to be. To the humans reading it, it was a sentence. It was many sentences, over many months, across 47 star systems, a slow, patient conversation conducted in the gaps between moments, in the white space of everyday compliance, in the margin of error that every monitoring system in the galaxy assumed was just inefficiency. Nobody was coordinating the network. That was the design. There was no central hub, no master communicator, no single point that, if found, would bring it down. It had been designed by a group of humans on 6 different assignment sites who had never met each other in person, but had worked out the architecture through the timing of their maintenance logs over a period of 4 months. To have no center, it was a web that didn't need a spider. Every node was both receiver and transmitter. Every human with access to a standard work terminal was, potentially, part of it. Not every human knew it existed, but enough did. And the ones who knew were learning. Ilara Vasquez spent the first year of the labor program on Kepler, 442b, maintaining the cover of the seismic survey station and building the file that was now 312 pages long. She spent the second year in the field. She got herself assigned to a Solari freighter crew through a labor allocation that she had spent 8 months engineering a sequence of availability signals and skill certifications submitted through the official conclave labor management system that made her profile appear to be exactly the kind of worker a Solari cargo operation would request. It had taken 8 months because the conclave's allocation algorithm was complex, and she needed to understand it well enough to operate it without appearing to operate it. She understood it well enough. On the freighter, the Solari vessel called the second measure of light, a name that the Solari considered poetic and the human crew considered ironic. She worked cargo loading for 14 months. She was a good worker. She was noted, twice, in the supervisor's quarterly reports as an exceptional contributor. She was also, during those 14 months, learning the inside of a Solari FTL drive maintenance system with the thoroughness of someone who intended to know it better than anyone who had designed it. She was not alone in this. She was never alone in this. There were 6 other humans on the second measure of light. They had all arrived through different allocation requests over a period of 3 months. They had not, in any communication that the Solari sensors would have caught, indicated any prior relationship. In the timing of their maintenance log submissions, they had extensive conversations. The child's name was Marco Reyes. He was 9 years old, which was Earth standard. In conclave age classifications, this put him in the dependent minor category, which meant he was housed in the family unit section of Camp 7 on Hesse Prime, the same camp where Yusra Alamin had been running numbers on Hessian. 4 concentrations for 14 months. Marco's mother was assigned to the camp's textile facility. His father had been transferred to a different site 6 months earlier, a mining operation in the outer belt, which paid better rations and which his father had requested for the same reason Soren had requested his hazardous role. Marco went to the camp school every morning. It was a real school. The conclave documentation for family unit camps was very clear that dependent minors were to receive education, because an educated workforce was a productive workforce. The teacher was a human woman named Ife, who had been a secondary school teacher on Earth before the allocation, and who taught the same subjects she had always taught. In the same way, with materials she had improvised from whatever she could find, Marco liked math. He was good at it in the way that some children are good at things before anyone teaches them to be naturally, instinctively, with a kind of pleasure in it. He got sick in the 4th month of the 2nd year. Yusra was the one who came to see him when the camp medical officer Vreth, present for 2 hours a day, had logged his illness as a minor respiratory incident and moved on. She sat with him in the family unit section and she checked his breathing and she looked at the atmospheric readings on her maintenance tablet. The concentration in the family unit section was running at 1.4 parts per million, above the conclave documentation's acceptable threshold, above the threshold that was, itself, a number based on 30-year-old data for short-term exposure. She went to the Vreth camp administrator. She showed him her readings. She used careful, polite language and cited the conclave's own documentation. The Vreth administrator told her that the atmospheric system was operating within standard parameters for the facility class. He told her that minor respiratory incidents were common in adjustment periods. He told her that the boy would likely acclimate. He put the relevant forms in the right files. Marco died on a Tuesday morning. He was in the camp medical bay, a room with 2 beds, and Ife was with him because his mother was at her shift assignment and had not been informed in time, and Marco should not have been alone. He was not alone. Ife held his hand. Yusra heard about it 3 hours later. She was in the atmospheric processor room, doing actual maintenance work on the filters. Real work. Necessary work. She had made herself useful in ways that gave her access to the equipment she needed to be near. She heard. She kept working. Her hands were steady. She noted the filter pressure. She logged the readings. In the timing of her next maintenance report, submitted 4 hours later, she sent a message through the network that translated, in the code, as Marco Reyes, Camp 7, Hesse Prime, age 9, Hessian, 4, 1.4 parts per million, 26 months of accumulated data attached. The data moved through the network in the white noise of 17 different timing signals across the following week. It reached Alara Vasquez on the second measure of light on a Thursday, embedded in a shift change confirmation from a human cargo worker on a station 2 relay points away. Alara was loading ore at the time. She read the signal in the rhythm of the confirmation's timestamp. The code was second nature now. The way a language becomes second nature. The way you stop translating and simply understand. She kept loading ore. Her hands did not stop moving. She finished her shift. She ate her rations reconstituted protein, the Solari standard issue, served in the human crew's separate meal area. She ate without tasting it. She went to her bunk. The bunk room was shared with 3 other humans, all part of the freighter's crew, all known to her in the way that counted. She lay down in the dark. She updated one file on the small, unnetworked device she kept beneath her mattress in a sealed case that looked like a toolkit. At the bottom of the file, she added a new section header. It said, Timeline. Below it, she wrote one line. Marco Reyes. He was 9. He was the last. She did not elaborate. She did not explain what she meant by times the last. She closed the file. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of the freighter's engines, a deep, constant vibration that had been the background of her life for 14 months, and she thought about a math problem with a very specific answer. The answer did not make her angry. It did not make her sad. It made her focused in a way that felt almost like calm. The Conclave's second annual report on human labor productivity was even better than the first. The numbers were extraordinary across every category. Human workers were not only outperforming projections, they were finding efficiencies in systems that the system's own designers hadn't known existed. They were suggesting improvements to processes. They were learning technical skills at rates that impressed even the Vreth, who considered themselves the galaxy's standard for engineering capability. There was a small section in the report on health incidents. The number was lower than the health incident rates for any previous class. 3 labor species in the first 2 years of allocation. The Conclave's Medical Affairs Office noted this positively. Humans were, apparently, a remarkably healthy and adaptable species. The section did not distinguish between health incidents recorded and health incidents reported. It did not flag the mortality data from Hessian, 4 facilities, because that data was filed under atmospheric adjustment incidents in a different department's records, and the 2 departments did not share a database. Dravan read the report on another Tuesday morning. He drank his tea. He was pleased. He did not ask how Marco Reyes's mother was doing in the textile facility on Hessa Prime. He did not ask because the allocation system did not generate that kind of data, and because it had not occurred to him to wonder. He sent the report to all 11 voting species governments. He attached a personal note. It said, among other things, that the program was exceeding all expectations, and that the Conclave could be proud of the careful, considered approach it had taken to this challenge. Somewhere in the white noise of 17 timing signals across 47 star systems, humans counted. They counted everything. They did not stop. It happened on a Tuesday. Nobody planned it for a Tuesday specifically. But the mathematics of it, the timing of labor shifts across 47 star systems, the rotation of Conclave communications windows, the position of relay satellites, the guard rotation schedules in 14 different facilities, all of it, when calculated, produced a Tuesday. And so, on a Tuesday, at 0600 hours by Earth Standard Time, in 47 star systems simultaneously, every human worker put down whatever they were holding. On a Vreth mining platform in the outer belt, a man named Gao Wei set down a drill assembly mid-operation. The drill was running. He just put down the component he'd been holding and stepped back. On a Solari food synthesis station, 4 women stopped in the middle of their processing shift and moved away from their stations. They did not turn the stations off. They just stopped touching them. On a Keth medical supply transport, a team of 6 humans assigned to loading and cargo management stepped back from the cargo bay doors and stood in a line. Not aggressively, just still. On the second measure of light, in the cargo hold where she had spent 14 months loading ore and learning everything about a Solari freighter that could be learned from the inside, Ilara Vasquez put down the loading harness she was wearing. She did it carefully. She set it on the deck with the same attention she gave every piece of equipment she worked with. Then she stood with her hands at her sides and waited. The Solari cargo supervisor entered the hold 40 seconds later. He was a young one, nervous in the way that young supervisors often are when something unexpected happens in a space they're responsible for. He demanded to know what was happening. Nobody answered him. He demanded again. Silence. He pulled out his communicator to call the ship's command deck and discovered that the ship's internal communications system was running a diagnostic. Automatically, scheduled by the maintenance AI. It had been scheduled by the maintenance AI because someone had, 3 weeks prior, with a very small adjustment to the scheduling algorithm, ensured that it would run at exactly this time. The diagnostic would take 4 minutes. 4 minutes in which every piece of Solari internal communication on the second measure of light ran through an automated system that could not be interrupted without manually overriding 3 separate safety protocols. The cargo supervisor stood in the hold and looked at 7 humans standing still and said nothing. And the 4 minutes passed. The way 4 minutes pass when you are afraid and don't know what you're afraid of. When the communications came back, he immediately connected to the command deck and reported what he was seeing. The command deck had received In the previous 4 minutes, 43 alerts from other Solari vessels reporting the same phenomenon. And those were only the Solari vessels. The Conclave-wide alert network, the system that allowed member species security forces to share emergency information in real time, had, in the previous 4 minutes, been receiving alerts from Vreth facilities, Keth stations, Doralai outposts, and 14 other sites across the mapped sectors. All of them the same. Humans stopped. What happened next happened in a sequence that no single observer saw in full. Suvel would spend the better part of a decade assembling it afterward, interviewing survivors and reviewing logs, and filling 3 volumes of historical record before he felt he had something close to the actual shape of the day. What he assembled looked like this. At the Vreth munitions stockpile on Outer Colony 4, the inventory management AI began generating error reports at 0607 hours. Not alarms error reports, the administrative kind, the ones that accumulate in a queue and get reviewed in the daily operations meeting. They looked like routine discrepancies. They were routine discrepancies, technically, except that the inventory AI had been given a small modification 3 weeks prior, a modification to the way it cross-referenced its stockpile records against its shipping manifests. And that modification meant that the error reports were not just routine discrepancies. They were a door, left slightly open, into the entire Vreth Outer Colony supply chain network. The modification had been made by a human maintenance technician who had been assigned to the stockpile's AI systems division for 7 months, and who had, during those 7 months, been an exceptional contributor, noted twice in his supervisor's quarterly reports. His name was Dmitry Volkov. He was 47 years old. He had been an AI systems engineer on Earth before the allocation. He was very good at his work. The door opened at 0609. Nobody came through it yet. The door just opened. At 0612, 14 Solari warships on a standard patrol route through the outer sectors, running on the navigational data provided by the Conclave's public navigation database, received simultaneous course corrections from what their navigation systems logged as a Conclave Traffic Authority update. The update was legitimate, in the sense that it had been submitted to the Traffic Authority's automated processing system by a registered user with valid access credentials. The credentials belonged to a Solari navigation technician who had reported them lost 18 months prior and received new ones. Nobody had deactivated the old credentials because the system that managed credential deactivation had a backlog of 17,000 open cases and hadn't gotten to them yet. The course corrections were small, technically within safety parameters. They routed each of the 14 warships through the same transit corridor at overlapping times. The Solari Traffic Authority's collision avoidance system caught the problem 11 minutes later and began issuing corrections. It was good at its job. It prevented 14 simultaneous collisions. It took every available processing cycle it had to do it. During those 11 minutes, the Traffic Authority's secondary systems, the ones that managed communication routing between Solari military vessels, were running at minimal capacity. At 0619, the Conclave's Galactic Communications Network began broadcasting. It broadcast on all frequencies, every channel, every range, in every language that the Conclave's translation database contained, which was to say, in every language spoken by every known intelligent species in the mapped galaxy. It broadcast a recording. The recording was of a small room spare, official, clearly a meeting space, and at a table in that room sat a woman with short gray hair and a dark blue coat and a silver pin on her left lapel. She was looking at the camera with the same expression she had worn in the conclave chamber 3 years ago. The cataloging expression. The measuring one, she said. You had a choice. You made it. So did we. Then the recording ended. And then it started again. It ran on every frequency for 42 minutes before the Conclave's communications security team managed to isolate and shut down the source nodes. They shut down 17 nodes before they realized that shutting down a node didn't stop the broadcast, it just removed one source. There were others. The broadcast was not coming from one place. It was distributed across the network in the same way the white noise network had been distributed, no center, no single point of failure, everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. It took 42 minutes to stop because stopping it required physically shutting down sections of the network, and shutting down sections of the network disrupted the emergency communications of 3 Conclave member species security forces who were, at that moment, trying to respond to the situation they were in the middle of. The Conclave's communications security chief would later note in her incident report that the broadcast appeared to have been embedded in the network's infrastructure at a point not less than 8 months prior to activation. It had been dormant, in pieces, across hundreds of network nodes, waiting. She noted that the technical skill required to do this without detection was, conservatively, well above anything the Conclave's threat assessment for Class 3 labor species had projected as possible. She underlined without detection twice. On the second measure of light, the 4 minutes ended, and the cargo supervisor made his frantic calls, and the ship's command deck went into emergency protocol. Ilara waited until the supervisor had left the cargo hold. He went to find someone with more authority, which took him in the direction of the command deck and away from her. She waited 20 more seconds. Then she moved. She went to the maintenance bay. She moved at a normal walking pace. Nothing about her movement said urgency. She had learned, in 14 months on this ship, that urgency attracted attention and normal movement did not. And the distance between those two things was the difference between being seen and being invisible. In the maintenance bay, behind a panel that she had been the one to install a modification to the coolant system routing that had improved the system's efficiency by 11%, which was why the chief engineer had approved it without examining it closely, was a case. The case was the size of a toolkit. She opened it. Inside was a communications device that had been built over 14 months from components that had arrived, piece by piece, in the standardized supply packages for the ship's maintenance systems. Each component was small. Each component was, on its own, nothing a sensor here, a frequency modulator there, a power cell that looked like a standard backup unit. Together they were something that the Solari custom scans had never flagged, because the scans were looking for completed devices and this had never been a completed device until the day before yesterday. When Ilara had assembled it, she opened the channel. She said 4 words, Vasquez to all cells. 3 years of silence answered her, not all at once. Not in voices. In the white noise pattern, the timing of signals from 47 star systems, the rhythm of what was happening everywhere simultaneously, the confirmation that came back in the gaps between moments. It was the most she had ever heard from her own species in 3 years. She closed the channel. She put the device back in the case. She put the case back behind the panel. She closed the panel. She walked back to the cargo hold and stood where she had been standing. And when the cargo supervisor returned with the first officer and 2 Solari security personnel, she was there, hands at her sides. Still, what is happening? The first officer asked. He was addressing all of them, the 7 humans in the hold, but he was looking at Ilara, because something about her told him that she was the one to look at. She looked back at him. She said nothing. In his office on New Geneva Station, Arch-Chancellor Dravan received his first emergency communication at 0614 hours. By 0619, he had received 20. By 0625, when his senior staff had gathered in his situation room, the number was 240. He stood at the situation room's display table and looked at the map. 47 systems. Simultaneous. The work stoppages alone would have been manageable. A labor disruption, a negotiation point, a security response, and then a compliance enforcement action. That was the playbook. That was what the Conclave's contingency protocols covered. But the work stoppages were not the thing he was looking at. He was looking at the door that had opened at the Vreth munitions stockpile on Outer Colony 4. His security chief had found it 12 minutes after it opened. She had sent him a report that was, by the standards of the bureaucratic language they both used, alarming. The modification to the inventory AI was professional-grade work. More than professional. It was elegant in the way that very few modifications were invisible until activated. Designed to look like a routine system quirk until someone looked at it carefully. And then, when looked at carefully, a door into something much larger. How large? Dravan asked. His security chief told him. Dravan sat down. He was not a man who sat down in the middle of a crisis. His staff had worked with him for 11 years. They had never seen him sit down in the middle of a crisis. He sat down. Because the supply chain infiltration, the access that the door at the munitions stockpile was connected to, was not limited to the munitions stockpile. It was not limited to Vreth infrastructure. The door at the munitions stockpile was one of, as best as his security team could determine in the first frantic hours, Over 400 similar modifications, access points, embedded backdoors, in facilities and ships and networks across 11 species infrastructure. 3 years. 3 years of exceptional contributors, model workers, hazardous assignment volunteers, efficient learners who wanted to understand the systems they worked with. 3 years of learning the inside of the machine. He looked at the map. He looked at the 47 simultaneous data points. He thought about the broadcast Chen Jing's face on every channel, in every language, saying times you had a choice. You made it times. And he thought about the fact that nobody in the Conclave's Threat Assessment Division had ever modeled this scenario. Not because they hadn't thought humans were capable of organizing, because they hadn't thought humans were capable of this kind of patience. He looked at the map for a long time. Then he called his communications officer and asked her to establish contact with any accessible human representative. The communications officer informed him, 4 minutes later, that every human representative in every conclave facility had, as of the work stoppage, entered a state of complete communications. Silence. They were not using their terminals. They were not accepting incoming calls. Their standard check-in signals the required status confirmations that every managed labor contributor was obligated to submit. Every 8 hours had stopped. Everywhere. Simultaneously. Can we find them? Dravan asked. We know where they are, his security chief said. They haven't moved. They're all at their assigned locations. They're just... She paused. They're waiting, she said. Dravan looked at the map for another long moment. He thought about Chen Jing's 30 seconds in the chamber. 29 of them silent. The 1 second that had mattered. He thought about the word times noted. He thought about what it meant, in the vocabulary of an ambassador who had spent 30 years in diplomatic service, to say times noted times when someone showed you what they were capable of, and then waited to see what you would do with the information. He thought about what 3 years of silence might mean in the same vocabulary. He thought about the fact that 47 simultaneous data points, a network that sounded like white noise, 400 access doors left open and not walked through. Yet none of it had been triggered by a provocation. No new legislation, no increase in conditions, no specific event. Except one. He had his staff pull the records from Camp 7 on Hessa Prime. He found the report of Marco Reyes's death, filed under atmospheric adjustment incidents, logged by the Vreth camp administrator as a minor health event. Complete, correct, in the right file. He looked at the report. He looked at the date. He looked at when the timeline section had been opened in a file on an unregistered device on a Solari freighter. They had found the device in a maintenance bay panel, still warm, logged off. Nothing on it now. The dates matched. A 9-year-old boy in a family unit camp had died of Hessian, 4 exposure, and 3 years of preparation had become a timeline. Dravan sat in the situation room with his staff around him and the map in front of him, and 47 systems worth of simultaneous data, and he felt, for the first time in his 11 years as Arch-Chancellor, that he was not reading a situation. He was inside one, and he did not know how large it was yet. On the second measure of light, in the cargo hold, Ilara Vasquez stood with her hands at her sides and waited, and outside the ship the stars turned, and in 47 systems her people waited with her, and in the white noise of the galaxy something had changed so completely that it would take everyone else a long time to understand what was different. What was different was this. The humans had stopped being quiet. The counting was done. The door was open. The Conclave mobilized its military in 61 hours. This was, by any historical standard, fast. The Conclave's combined security forces spanned 11 species and required coordination across multiple command structures, competing communication protocols, and the logistical reality that the forces were already spread across 47 star systems, responding to 47 simultaneous situations. 61 hours was an achievement. The Conclave's military coordination chief would later say, in his post-action report, that he was proud of the response time. He would write the report from a facility that was running on emergency power, because the primary power grid for his home colony had experienced a technical malfunction. The malfunction was not a coincidence. The Conclave's military forces converged on the coordinates they had for known human positions, the labor camps, the assignment stations, the facilities where human workers had been logged as present at the time of the work stoppage. They deployed in force. The Vreth sent their heaviest patrol vessels. The Solari repositioned 3 warship squadrons. The Keth, The Hillary, the Muon, all of them pulled from their standard routes and redirected. They arrived to find the camps empty. Not abandoned in a hurry, not broken doors and scattered belongings and the signs of a fast exit. Empty in the way that a room is empty when it has been cleaned. Beds made. Equipment logged off. Personal items gone. Assignment documents filed. Because the human workers had taken the time, on their way out of every facility simultaneously, to file the standard end-of-shift documentation through the Conclave labor management system. The documentation was complete and correct in every detail. The military commander who entered Camp 7 on Hessa Prime, a Vreth officer, named Sector Commander Hareth, stood in the center of the main yard for a long moment and looked at the empty buildings. The atmospheric processor was still running. The maintenance logs were fully up to date. The most recent entry was time-stamped 48 minutes after the work stoppage began, and it was a routine filter check notation, written in the same careful shorthand as every other entry in the system, signed with the identifier of a human maintenance technician named Yusra Al-Amin. Hareth stood in the yard and felt the particular cold of a place that had been full of people a short time ago, and was not anymore. He had served 20 years in the Vreth military. He knew the feeling of abandoned territory, of positions taken and positions evacuated. This did not feel like an evacuation. It felt like a departure. He contacted the Conclave Military Coordination Center and asked for the current tracking data on known human positions. The Coordination Center told him what they had managed to establish in the 61 hours since the work stoppage. The humans were not where they had been. They were not gathered in any identifiable location. The FTL tracking systems that the Conclave used to monitor ship movements were showing data, but the data was inconsistent. Ships appearing and disappearing from sensors in ways that suggested either sensor malfunction or a level of electronic interference that the Conclave's threat assessment had not modeled as possible for a class. 3 labor species. They could not find the humans. Not all of them. Not most of them. Not enough of them to matter. 47 star systems, and the humans were somewhere in them, and the Conclave's military apparatus, which had been built over generations to fight the kinds of wars that species fight when they are approximately equal in capability, and both sides have visible positions and predictable supply needs, was looking at a problem it did not have the vocabulary to solve. What humans target, when they finally move, was not what any of the Conclave's war strategists had modeled. The war strategists had spent time real-time, detailed hours of planning on human rebellion scenarios. They had considered population center attacks. They had considered strikes on military installations. They had considered sabotage of manufacturing hubs. They had considered hostage scenarios, demands, ultimatums, with deadlines. They had modeled all of it. None of it happened. What happened was quieter and more precise and more devastating than anything that had appeared in any strategic model, because it required an understanding of Conclave infrastructure that the Conclave's own strategists did not fully have. The Vreth Outer Colony Food Synthesis Network was the first thing to slow down, not stop slow. The automated distribution system for the synthesizer's raw inputs began experiencing scheduling conflicts. Small ones. The kind that required manual review before being resolved, and then more of them. And then the backlog of manual reviews grew. Because the system that managed the backlog was also experiencing scheduling conflicts, and the technicians who normally handled manual reviews were dealing with a secondary issue in the atmospheric processing grid that was taking priority. The atmospheric processing grid issue was also small. Also the kind of thing that required attention before it became a bigger thing. Also running through a backlog. Everything was running through a backlog. Everything was running slightly wrong in ways that individually constituted maintenance issues and collectively constituted a structural failure of the Vreth Outer Colony's ability to feed its population. It would take, at the current rate of degradation, 4 months. The Solari faced a different problem. Their FTL drive maintenance network, the system of depot stations and supply relays that kept their warship fleet operational had, it turned out, been deeply understood by a number of human workers who had spent their allocated years in exactly the facilities that kept it running. The understanding had been translated into a series of modifications to the automated maintenance scheduling system. Modifications that were, again, small, correct, even, in the sense that each individual adjustment improved the system's performance on a narrow metric, but they were optimized for the wrong thing. They prioritized short-term efficiency at the cost of long-term component integrity, in a way that would not become visible on standard monitoring for approximately 6 weeks. At 6 weeks, the Solari fleet would begin experiencing drive component failures, not catastrophic failures, degradation failures, the kind that grounded ships, the kind that required extensive repair work, the kind that would, if they hit multiple vessels in the same patrol network simultaneously, leave significant gaps in coverage. The Keth received a different gift. Their medical supply chain had been rerouted, very carefully, in a way that meant supplies were arriving at facilities that didn't need them and not arriving at facilities that did. The rerouting was built into the supply chain AI's optimization logic in a place that required someone who understood the AI's architecture to find. The Keth had replaced the human worker who built the rerouting 3 months before the work stoppage, and the new worker, a Keth, this time, because the Keth had started worrying about humans in sensitive roles, had reviewed the system and found nothing wrong. They had not found nothing wrong because there was nothing wrong. They had found nothing wrong because they were looking for sabotage, and this did not look like sabotage. It looked like an optimization. Each thing was small. Each thing was defensible, technically, as a system quirk or a maintenance issue, or an optimization that had produced unexpected downstream effects. Each thing, alone, could be fixed. The Conclave's infrastructure teams were good. They could fix things. But fixing one thing created the conditions for 2 others to go wrong, because the network of modifications was not a list of targets. It was an architecture. It had been designed by people who had spent 3 years living inside the machine, learning its dependencies, mapping its vulnerabilities to fail, in sequence. Fixing the sequence meant understanding the whole of it, and understanding the whole of it required knowing what humans had done, and where, and when, and in what order. The Conclave did not know. The humans had not left a map. The Solari were the first to request negotiations. 11 days after the work stoppage, the Solari Ambassador General, a career military diplomat named Velsan, who had served for 30 years, and had never in those 30 years been in a situation that felt like this, arrived at a set of coordinates that had been transmitted through a channel that had appeared in the Conclave's communication network, without any logged origin point. The coordinates were in neutral space, a small station, minimal infrastructure, the kind of place that existed to facilitate exactly this sort of meeting. Velsan came with a full honor guard and a document. The document was a concession offer. It had been drafted by the Solari legal team over 9 days of intensive work, and it represented, he had been told, the most generous concession package the Solari government had ever offered to any party in any negotiation in Solari recorded history. It included, among other things, labor program termination, financial reparations calculated on a per-worker basis, and a formal statement of regret that had been reviewed by the Solari head of state before signing. The human delegation arrived with 3 people. No honor guard, no formal dress. The lead negotiator was a man Velsan didn't recognize, a tall, quietly spoken man named Osei Mensa, who walked with a slight limp from what looked like an old injury, and who wore his labor camp identification tag clipped to his jacket. Not as a badge, not to make a statement. Exactly. Just because it was there, and he hadn't taken it off. Velsan presented the document. Mensa read it. He took his time. Nobody spoke while he read. When he finished, he set it on the table between them with the same care you give something you're done with. He looked at Velsan. "We're not here to negotiate peace," he said. Velsan was a diplomat. He had steady nerves. He kept them steady now. "Then what are you here to negotiate?" "Terms," Mensa said. "Terms for what?" Mensa looked at him for a moment. Not unkindly. In the way that someone looks at a question they are deciding how to answer. "Terms for what we don't do next," he said. Ilara got the message from Dravan on the 4th day. She was on a stolen Vreth scout ship, small, fast, designed for a 2-person crew, modified by its current 4-person crew, to run quieter and stranger than the Vreth engineers had intended. She was coordinating across 12 systems simultaneously, which was the kind of task that would have seemed impossible 3 years ago, and now felt like half a problem, because she had people who were good, who were better than good, who had spent 3 years becoming exactly what this required. The message came through the channel that had been established for direct conclave communications with the human resistance, a channel that the conclave had requested and that the humans had agreed to use because communication was not surrender, and also because the channel gave them information about who was calling and from where and how urgently. It was Dravan calling, directly, Arch-Chancellor, not a representative, not a go-between. She accepted it. He appeared on her screen. He looked, she noticed, older. Not dramatically, 3 years wasn't that long, but the way a person ages when they have been carrying something heavy and trying not to show it. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there in the vote footage. She had watched the vote footage many times. She knew his face. His translator ran slightly slow on her system, a tenth of a second behind his mouth. She had never fixed this. She found it clarifying, somehow. That gap between the word and the thing. He asked her what humanity wanted. She was eating when the message came through. She had forgotten to eat again. It happened when she was in coordination mode, hours going by without noticing, and she had picked up a food packet sometime in the last hour, and then forgotten she was holding it. It was in her hand when she accepted the call. She looked at it. Vreth-branded reconstituted protein. From the same supplier that had stocked the family units on Hesse Prime. She looked at it for a long moment. Noted, she said. She closed the channel. The Helori requested negotiations on day 14. The Keth on day 17. The Muin and the Doralai together on day 19, in a joint communication that suggested they had been talking to each other and had decided that combined representation was safer. Safir. That was the word they used. In the Vreth Situation Room, where Dravan had been spending most of his time for the past 3 weeks. His senior staff compiled the status reports every morning, and he read them, and the picture they painted was consistent and worsening. The food synthesis slowdown had not been fixed. The technical team understood, now, what had been done to it. They had mapped most of the modification architecture, but mapping it and reversing it were different problems, and reversing it, without triggering the downstream failures that had been built into the reversal process, required a level of understanding of the specific system that they were still developing. The Solari FTL maintenance problem was on track for the 6-week degradation the initial models had predicted. The Solari were working on it. They had brought in their best engineers. The engineers were good. They were not as good as the people who had built the problem. Harith sent a report from the outer colonies. The camps were being maintained. This was the part nobody had quite expected by the automated systems that the humans had installed or modified during their time in the program. The atmospheric processors were running clean. The agricultural plots that some of the camps had established were being tended by automated systems that the humans had built and calibrated, running on schedules that the humans had programmed. The camps were, in a very specific and pointed way, in better working order, with no humans present than they had been before the humans arrived. Harith wrote, at the end of his report, I do not believe this is coincidental. I believe it is a demonstration. Dravan read the word times, demonstration times, and sat with it. He had spent 3 years thinking about human labor in terms of productivity, efficiency, output. He had read reports. He had noted impressive numbers. He had felt the satisfied sense of a decision validated by data. He had not been asking the right question. The right question was not what humans were producing. The right question was what they were learning while producing it. He sat at his situation table and looked at the map and thought about the difference between those two questions. And the difference was the size of the galaxy. He called for his communications officer and asked her to establish a channel to the human negotiating team. He was going to speak to Mensa. He was going to ask, directly, what the terms were. He was going to listen to every word and every silence, and every tenth of a second gap between the word and the thing. Because he had made the mistake, 3 years ago, of hearing noted and moving on. He was not going to make that mistake again. The negotiations lasted 19 days. They were held, at human insistence, on New Geneva Station, in the same chamber where the vote had taken place. The Vreth had proposed alternative locations, neutral space, a purpose-built facility, several other options that all had in common the quality of not being the room where everything had started. Mensa refused each alternative in the same language. No, not, we would prefer. Not, that does not meet our requirements. Just the word, alone. The way a door closing sounds. So they met in the chamber with the dome ceiling, and the 17 atmospheric mixes, and the view of the gas giant's rings, turning in the light of two suns. The conclave spent 4 days preparing the room, adjusting settings, ensuring the human delegation would find the environment acceptable. The human delegation arrived with 17 people, including 2 who used mobility aids, and 1 who brought a child, a girl of perhaps 10, who sat quietly in the back of the room for the entire first session, drawing something in a notebook, and whom nobody asked about because nobody could determine the right way to ask. Mensa led. Beside him were people whose names the conclave representatives recognized from labor camp records, from facility assignments, from 3 years of quarterly productivity reports. They were identified in those reports by their worker codes. Here they had names, and the names were on the table placards, and nobody on the conclave side could quite resolve the gap between those two facts. Drevon came himself for the first 3 days. This was unusual. The Arch-Chancellor did not typically conduct negotiations directly. He came because he had read 3 years of data and arrived, finally, at the conclusion that everything he had understood about this situation was wrong, and he wanted to hear what was right from the people who knew. He sat across from Mensa and he listened. Mensa talked for a long time on the first day. He talked about the vote. He talked about the language of the legislation, and the words that had been chosen, and the words that had not. He talked about Soren, who was 41, and died of a cardiac event on a Vreth outer colony. He talked about 6 others whose names Drevon had not known before this room. He talked about Marco Reyes. He talked about Marco Reyes for a long time. He did not raise his voice. He did not use emotional language. He spoke the way a person speaks when they have thought about something for a very long time, and the thinking is done, and what remains is just the fact of it. Clean, and finished, and heavy. Drevon listened. When Mensa finished talking, Drevon said, "What do you want?" What humanity wanted was not what anyone expected. Not territory. The conclave's legal team had prepared for territorial demands. They had models for it, precedent from 2 previous interspecies conflicts, a framework for how boundary negotiations worked, not reparations in the conventional sense. They had prepared for that too. Financial, material, infrastructure transfers, all of it modeled, all of it with parameters the legal teams had developed over decades. Not the dismantling of the conclave itself, though this had been discussed in whispered side conversations among the member species delegations as the negotiation days accumulated. Some of them had thought this was coming. Some of them had arranged, quietly, contingency plans for what they would do if the conclave structure collapsed. The contingency plans were unnecessary. Humanity asked for accountability. The word took a few minutes to translate properly, because the conclave's translation systems had precise equivalents for justice, punishment, reparation, remedy, all the formal vocabulary of international conflict resolution. But the word, accountability, in the specific way Mensa used it, was slightly different from all of those, and the translators ran it through 3 passes before they were confident in the rendering. What Mensa described was this. Every representative who had voted yes in the classification session, every ambassador, every government official who had instructed their ambassador to vote yes, every species head of state who had signed the authorization for the vote would be entered, by name, into the Galactic Permanent Record. The Galactic Permanent Record was the conclave's official archive of historical events. It was irrevocable by design. It was distributed across every known civilization's data infrastructure. It was, in practical terms, the closest thing the galaxy had to an objective historical document maintained by a process that required the agreement of all member species to alter and alterable for factual corrections only. Once something was in the record, it stayed, not as criminals, not with a formal legal designation of guilt. The conclave's legal team, in the first hours after Mensa explained this, had actually started to feel a complicated kind of relief. This was not a war crimes tribunal, not a legal proceeding, not something that required the apparatus of prosecution and evidence and judgment. It was something simpler and harder. The names would be entered into the record under a factual heading. The heading would state that these were the individuals who voted yes to the classification of humanity as a labor species. It would note the date. It would note the vote count. It would note that the vote was unanimous among all member species present. It would not say anything else about them. It would not call them criminals. It would not explain what happened next. It would just be there. Forever. In every archive. Distributed to every civilization that would ever join the conclave. Every civilization that would ever be discovered. Every data system maintained across every known stellar body. For as long as those systems ran. The names and what they had done. The conclave's legal team asked Mensa what purpose this served. In terms of legal remedy. Mensa looked at the legal team representative, a senior Vreth lawyer, who had been in his profession for 40 years, and had a careful and precise mind, and who was genuinely asking, not stalling. None, Mensa said. It doesn't serve a legal purpose. Then what does it serve? Mensa thought about it for a moment. Memory, he said. The second demand was for a new clause in galactic law. It was 4 words long. The conclave's legal team spent 9 days on those 4 words. Not because the words were complex, they were not. They were, by the standards of galactic legal language, almost absurdly simple. They spent 9 days on them because of the question those words raised, which was, what, precisely, did they constitute? A threat? A statement of policy? An assertion of legal standing? A declaration of something that did not have a category in existing conclave law? The 4 words were, humanity does not forget. That was the clause. In full. Written in galactic standard legal font, in the standard size, without additional clauses, without elaboration, without a definition section specifying what forget meant in this context, or what the legal consequences of the clause's violation would be. No consequences were specified. The clause just said what it said. The conclave's legal scholars, and there were many of them, from 9 species, all called in to review this, could not agree on what it meant in operational terms. Some argued it was legally meaningless without defined enforcement mechanisms. Some argued that it was a declaratory clause, establishing intent without requiring specificity. Some argued that its very ambiguity was its function. That last group was correct. One young Solari legal scholar, reviewing the clause on the 14th day of negotiations, wrote in her private notes, "The clause functions as a permanent reminder. It is not a law. It is a fact. And facts do not require enforcement mechanisms because they do not require compliance. They simply are." She shared her notes with her senior colleague. Her senior colleague read them. Then he looked at the clause again for a long time. "They designed it this way," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "They want the ambiguity. They want the uncertainty," she said. "Those are different things." He read the clause a 3rd time. Then he set it down. He said, "What do we not know about what they were going to do? What's in the blank space?" And she said, "That's the point." The signing took place on the 19th day. The same chamber, the same dome, the same gas giant's rings, still turning, still catching the light. Ilara was there. She had not been part of the negotiating team. She had never been a diplomat, had never wanted to be, had spent 3 years being something much more specific. She sat in the back of the chamber, in the observer tier, on the 3rd level, left side, the same bench where Suvel had sat 3 years ago. She did not know that. She sat there because it was the back, and because from the back, you could see everything. She watched Mensa sign the document. She watched Drevon sign it, his hand steady, his face the face of a man who was doing what he had determined needed to be done, and was not pretending to feel good about it. She watched the representatives of 11 species sign it, one by one, at the long curved table that had once held a different document being enacted, with much greater enthusiasm. When it was done, Mensa looked up from the table and found her, somehow, in the back of the room. She wasn't sure how the chamber was full, and she was not in a visible seat. But he found her, and they looked at each other for a moment. She nodded. He nodded back. She turned and looked up through the dome at the rings, the gold and the violet, the slow, indifferent turning of rock and ice in the light of 2 suns that had been turning since before any of the species in this room existed, and would keep turning long after. The girl who had been drawing in her notebook was still in the back of the room. She had been drawing for 19 days, 1 drawing per session, a series of something that nobody had looked at closely, because the girl was quiet and didn't create a disruption. Ilara glanced at the notebook as she stood to leave. The girl was drawing the same thing, in slightly different versions, across every page that Ilara could see. The gas giant. The rings. From above, From below, from the side, different angles, different light, the same subject. Something enormous, turning. A Solari junior diplomat found Alara in the corridor outside the chamber as the post-signing reception was beginning inside. He was young, genuinely young, early in his career. The kind of young that still asks questions the older ones have learned not to ask. His name was San Ray, and he had been attached to the Solari delegation as a junior aide, and he had spent 19 days watching negotiations that he would spend the rest of his career thinking about. He had one question. He had been warned not to ask it by 3 separate senior colleagues. He asked it anyway. "What were you going to do?" he said. "Before we agreed. Before the Vreth." He stopped, found the right words. "There's a blank space," he said. "In the document, in the record. The section where the human delegation's full strategic plan is listed. There's a section heading and then nothing. Everything else is in the record. What you did, how you did it, the infrastructure modifications, all of it. But that section," he stopped again. "It's blank," he said. Alara looked at him. He was young enough that she could see the genuine fear under the question, which meant he was smart enough to know that the fear was appropriate. She looked at him for a moment the way Chen Jing had looked at the chamber on the day of the vote. Not unkindly. "Measuring. Nothing," she said. He blinked. "I'm sorry?" There was nothing in that section. She looked at him steadily. We hadn't gotten there yet. He stood in the corridor and tried to determine if she was telling the truth. He was a diplomat. He was trained in reading people. He looked at her face and her posture and the specific quality of her stillness, and he could not tell. He could not tell at all. She left. Suvel of the Ithani published the first volume of his history of these events, 4 years after the signing. In the final chapter, he wrote about the blank space, about the question that San Ray had asked in the corridor, and what Alara had answered, and what that answer meant or did not mean. He wrote, "We have not agreed, in my conversations with colleagues across 5 species and 2 academic traditions, on whether Alara Vasquez told the truth. She has not, in the years since the signing, given any other statement on the subject. The blank space in the galactic record remains blank, which is itself a choice. The human delegation could have filled it, could have entered any text they chose, could have put a statement in the record explaining what was in that section, or confirming that there was nothing. They chose to leave it blank. This is, I have come to believe, the most deliberate thing they did in the entire 19 days. The clause says, humanity does not forget. The blank space says something adjacent but different. It says, we know what we are capable of, and we have chosen not to tell you. That choice is ours. The blank space is ours. What fills it in your imagination, in your models, in the calculations you run late at night about what a species that built a 3-year invisible network inside your own infrastructure might do, if pushed to the point where that network was not enough. That is also Urs. The conclave spent 2 years after the signing reviewing its infrastructure for additional modifications. They found some. They fixed them. They reviewed again. They found more. They do not know how many there are. That is not an accident. In my 40 years as an observer of conclave affairs, I have watched many negotiations. I have watched species make demands, and species make concessions, and species arrive at arrangements that both parties can live with. I have watched the careful, necessary work of civilizations, finding ways to coexist. I have never watched anyone build a blank space into a peace agreement before. I have been thinking about it for 4 years. What I have concluded is this. The blank space is not a threat. A threat requires specificity. It requires that you know what is being threatened, and when, and under what conditions. The blank space does not tell you any of those things. What it tells you is that humans counted for 3 years in silence, and built something extraordinary in the margins of the machine that was supposed to contain them. And when they were finally done counting, they opened 400 doors and walked through none of them. The doors are still there. I believe they are still there, intentionally, and I believe that the single most important sentence ever entered into the galactic permanent record is 4 words long, and contains, in those 4 words, the architecture of an entirely new kind of deterrence, one that operates not through the demonstration of capability, but through the maintenance of uncertainty about it. Humanity does not forget. Neither does anyone who was in that chamber. Neither do I. I abstained from the vote. I did not vote yes, and I did not vote no. I told myself, for a long time, that this was wisdom, that caution was its own form of integrity, that watching and recording and not acting was a legitimate position for a species to take. I no longer believe this. In the galactic record, alongside the names of those who voted yes, there is a separate notation. It is a full list of all species present at the session. It notes, for each species, how they voted. For the Athani, it says, abstained. I read that word in the record sometimes. It is the most precisely accurate and most completely wrong thing I have ever read. We were there. We saw. We did nothing. We did not vote yes. We also did not vote no. The humans built something extraordinary in the silence of those who said nothing. I do not know if they have forgiven us. I have not asked. I am not certain. I want to know the answer. Humanity does not forget. I know what that means now. I wish I had known it sooner. But that, I have decided, is exactly the kind of thing you think in a universe where a blank space in a document is the most powerful sentence ever written, because you will never know if you learned the lesson early enough until the moment you find out you didn't. And by then, of course, it is far too late to take notes. Suvelle of the Athani, A History of the Vasquez Accords, Volume 1, Final Entry.